happen. It's not even an option. So, for example, the whole business about telecommunications, including the 1966 Telecommunications Act and this latest thing, it's not even treated as a public interest story. It's a business story. How should the system be handed over to private power? Not should it be handed over to private power. That's not even at issue. Just what modality should be used to take this huge public giveaway and hand it over to private power. And notice there's a little more than just giving the aircraft industry away, because this whole system is crucial for the functioning of a democratic system, but virtually no discussion. The public is not supposed to be involved in this. That's true in practice, not just in this case, but in the whole background. And it's even a principle. It's a principle you can read about in standard texts on American politics. For example, one that's written by, a couple of years ago, by a guy with the lovely title of Professor of Science of Government at Harvard, who explained that the architects of power must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to sunlight, it begins to evaporate. I think that statement is very accurate, just like the statements by other leading intellectuals and academics who I quoted earlier. And part of the task of the institutions that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young and everyone else is to protect power from exposure. The Cold War provided a framework for that, but the issue is far broader, and it remains with us long after the Berlin Wall has thankfully collapsed into ruins.
The last teach-in of the Vietnam War. And I mean, we've been on a lot of platforms separately since, but nobody has ever dared to put us together. And, but I say it was the last teach-in of the Vietnam War. It happened at Brandeis, and we were having a teach-in to protest against American military aid to the Saigon government. It was the end of April 1975, and as we were sitting on a platform, a Brandeis student came running down the aisle holding a dispatch, news dispatch in his hand, and said, "The Saigon government has surrendered, the war in Vietnam is over." The place exploded. That was the last teach-in of the war. So I'm hoping that sometime in the course of the evening, somebody will come and give us some real good news. You know, like every government in the world has been overthrown. Anyway, I think it's useful to expand the definition of sort of the Cold War from the traditional one, as Noam was talking about. And the traditional one, has it starting at the end of World War II, and the United States confronting the Soviet Union, and then follows a whole series of interventions by, the Soviet Union takes over Eastern Europe, the United States intervenes in a lot of other places in the world, and it all ends happily in 1989. When, as everybody knows, the Cold War is over, capitalism has triumphed, and everybody's happy. I walk around looking for signs of happiness now that it's over. But you look at the characteristics of that Cold War, the characteristics in the United States being a military apparatus, military intervention, repression at home. Well, you find that these characteristics exist before 1945. Well, as Noam was saying, you can extend the Cold War back to 1917 to the American military intervention in Siberia to try to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. But if you look before 1917, before there was a Soviet Union, right, and you find the United States intervening again and again and again, right? The United States intervening in Cuba, the United States taking over the Philippines, taking over Hawaii, intervening in Panama. The Marines are going into the Dominican Republic, they go into Haiti, and all this before 1917, before there's a communist threat. And at the same time, we're having repression at home, and before there's a Bolshevik revolution, the people who are speaking out against World War I in the United States are arrested and put in jail. All this before there's a Soviet Union. It suggests that there isn't that clear-cut sort of beginning of that Cold War period and a clear-cut ending. Well, certainly, does 1989 end American military intervention in other parts of the world? Now that there's no Soviet threat, no more military intervention, well, we soon have several more, And, of course, we have the Gulf War. No Soviet threat, but you can always find a good reason for having a war. You don't need the Soviet Union. It just helped a lot to have the Soviet Union around during that period. It helped a lot for intervention. You could call anything a Soviet threat, right? Somebody is elected democratically in Guatemala in 1954. Democratically elected, that's what we say we want. No, not then, no. Not if you pick the wrong guy. Not if the people have elected somebody who takes over the land of United Fruit. Well, we can't have that. United Fruit is us. And so we overthrow the government of Guatemala. It's not a communist threat. Iran, 1953, overthrow the government of Iran, no communist threat. Of course, there's oil. You don't need a communist threat if you have oil, you say. So, 1989, capitalism wins. Everything is fine. Is everything fine? Democracy has come to all the formerly Soviet East Bloc countries. Really? Oh, they've had elections in the Soviet Union? They have a two-party state? 3, 4, 5, 6? At the same time that we become a one-party state? And here in the United States, can we talk about the triumph of capitalism in the United States? How wonderful it is now that we've defeated the Soviet Union, and we know we don't have to worry about them anymore. Everything is fine here. The Dow Jones average is way up. That's terrific. The Dow Jones average tells us exactly how Americans are faring. It must be the measure of the economic prosperity of all Americans, because it's there on the news every night. You can't miss it. If the Dow Jones average has gone up, we're obviously all doing better, you see. You can try it out. Next time you're in a restaurant, just say to the waitress, "Did you know that the Dow Jones average has gone up 30 points?" She'll be very happy to hear that. Why don't they put on TV how many people are looking for work? Why don't they put on TV statistics about how many kids died yesterday before the age of 1 because they were sick, they couldn't get medical care, because they didn't have enough to eat? There are all sorts of figures and statistics they could put on television beside the Dow Jones average to give us a picture of what really is happening in this country. I'm suggesting that we need to extend this whole question of the Cold War from that period in which the Soviet Union became partly the reason and partly the excuse, for what the United States was doing before the Soviet Union arrived on the scene, and what the United States has been doing since the Soviet Union left the scene. And that is, there's a larger and long continuum of struggle for peace and justice in the world, struggle for change in the world, struggle to overthrow governments in the world, struggle to change the system here. And that went on before, and that's continuing to go on now. And the universities, well, they can't escape it. And when you first enter universities, you think you're going to escape it. You think, the university, it'll be nice there. It's not like the rest of the world, you know, but it is. It's just like the rest of the world. Money, power, commerce, greed, competition. Well, it's part of the rest of the world. And who controls the universities? Very often the same people who control the business corporations, right? And how much democracy is there in the university? I mean, universities are not democratic. I mean, some universities even pride themselves in not being democratic. Some university presidents say, no. I didn't mean to say that. It's really. But universities are supposed to, you know, yes, they're part of the system, and as Noam said, they have jobs. Their job is to indoctrinate. Their job is to keep control. Their job is to turn people out, you know, who will take their obedient places in society to do the jobs that need to be done in society and not to make any trouble. Really. The problem is that universities are also something else. And that is they're places where people read. And there are libraries. And people have a little more time to think. And there are a lot of young people in universities, and there's a certain idealism in young people, you know, before they've been captured by the real world. I mean, they've escaped from their parents. They've not yet been captured by the business world. They have a few moments to think, you see. So there are great possibilities there, possibilities for trouble. In 1950, I was going to say, I remember in 1950. No, I don't remember anything about 1950. But in 1950, a congressman from Illinois, Harold Velde of Illinois, he was a former FBI man, perfect congressman, of course, and soon to be a member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And Velde got up in Congress and spoke out against a bill. The bill was to appropriate money for mobile libraries to go through the rural areas so that people in rural areas would have books to read. And Velde spoke up against it and saying, education is the first step towards communism. Well, I mean, he was not quite right, of course, you know, because mostly education is not. But it has all sorts of dangerous possibilities, and at certain points in history, those possibilities become real. I was teaching in the South, from 1956 to 1963. I was teaching at a black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia, and I could see when I got there in the 50s, I could see my students acting out the role that college students in colleges and universities were supposed to play. That is, these young black women were there to learn well and to take their place in the segregated society of the United States, to become the social workers and teachers and maybe an occasional doctor and lawyer, but yeah, to take their, and they were trained that way, and they were supposed to be obedient, and they were regulated and controlled that way. But then something happened, and as everybody knows. And then suddenly everything changed. And some people stepped out first, and then other people stepped out, and soon that wall that was around our campus had been taken down, and the students were out in the street and out demonstrating and out getting arrested, and learning. Very important. And their education was beginning in a real way. I remember a colleague of mine saying, "This is bad. My students are cutting my classes. You know, they're ruining their education." Well, I mean, what happened in the 60s is the students who went out the black students who went out in the civil rights movement, and then in the anti-war movement, the students who got involved in the anti-war movement, they were giving themselves a marvelous education. They were learning so much about the world. And if and when they went back to the classroom, they went back with a much, much greater curiosity about the world, a much, much wider understanding of what they should look for and what books to look for and what ideas to look for, and a much more critical understanding of what was missing in the education that they had gotten up to that point. You know, I saw that in my students who went out, and when they came back from jail, they were looking for Du Bois, and they were looking for black history, and they were looking for things that didn't exist in their education before. And what happened in those movements, and this is the dangerous thing about education. So, you know, students who step outside the classroom become dangerous. Students who confront the real world, students who learn about governance, students who learn about the police, students who learn that the things that were taught to them in junior high school about how the government works, you know. Oh, this is democracy. We have 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, judicial. We have checks and balances. Great. Yeah. And then they walk out in one demonstration on one peaceful picket line, and the world comes crashing down on them. And yes, education. This is what they have against the 60s. You notice they have something against the 60s? You see, all sorts of things happen. Education changed. People began to think in a different way, in a more critical way. And the curriculum began to change. Yeah, you know, well, we know that, you know, black studies and feminist studies and even gay studies, and well, as a result, there's a lot of hysteria around now among, you know, the people up there, out there. I don't know where they are exactly, but you know, their emanations come to us from time to time, you know, and they're wild. You know, it started with I don't know if it started with Alan Bloom, but he became, you know, the closing of the American mind. You know, the 60s had closed the American mind. I don't know, it closed his mind. You see, it closed his mind to what was going on. But they were upset that students were. He was upset students were leaving his seminar on Plato and going out into the street to demonstrate. You see, this is intolerable. Well, this is what was happening. And so all this, you know, multicultural education, a terrible thought. Feminist studies, a terrible thought. But what it means is that, yes, the movements had an effect on the universities, had an effect on the curriculum, it had an effect on the ideas of young people, and they didn't like that. They've been working to suppress that and working to change that and working to regain control. Really, that's what's been happening. When they talk about doing away with the Vietnam syndrome, they're trying to do away with the things that people learned in the 60s about war, about government, about education. I mean, the hope is that they won't succeed. That the history of those years will not be lost, that the exhilaration of those movements will not be forgotten, that education will begin to have the kind of meaning that education always has when people are engaged in social struggle for justice. And so there are things for university students to do, and college students and community college students and other people to do these days. Obviously, since the Cold War, in the larger sense, is not over. That is, the struggle is not over. The $250 billion military budget, and the no money for this, and no money for that, no money for health, and no money for women, and no money for children, and no money for this. There's just money for the military budget. And as for these other people, if too many of them are going to be in trouble and desperate and hanging around the streets and committing crime and taking drugs, well, we'll just build more jails for them, and that will take care. That's the situation we're facing, and it's a situation which calls for a new social movement in this country. Absolutely. And a situation in which we need, I mean, there you have 12 people who are ready to join it, you see. But it's a good beginning, you say. Yes, and the hope is that university students can play a role in this. And things are happening all the time in which people can take part. Somebody's happening this Saturday with the homeless in Boston. Some group right in Boston meeting at Copley Square. There's a group that's organized to for people to occupy, people who need homes to occupy the thousands and thousands of vacant places that exist that are owned by the city that are not being used while there are homeless people on the streets. There's all sorts of things going on, all sorts of cultural things going on. They're showing the movie Attica. You know, it's not necessary for the population to believe that prisons are the answer to poverty and crime and so on. All sorts of things are happening out there which we can all be a part of. And so I hope we will. Thank you.
Howard just asked me to add a footnote to his final comments, and that is, as we were walking in, we got an announcement that Detroit, I didn't have a chance to read it yet, so I'll just read it off. The Detroit newspaper strikers are in town, or will be, and there's going to be an event 4 o'clock on Thursday. Well, that's a talk, but at 9 a.m. Saturday, February 22nd, there's going to be a rally at Sullivan, local 25 parking lot near Sullivan Square, and it's going to be a caravan going to the Gannett plant in Norwood. This is part of a protest in support of the Detroit newspaper strikers who've been out for a long time. That now amounts to a lockout. You can hear more about it there.
Well, there's a question period.
Thanks for the announcement, Noam. In the light of that, I was amazed to see strikers, union members from the Detroit newspapers earlier today who informed us that this strike was continuing, because I had read in the New York Times, and of course it's the absolute truth in a very pro-labor newspaper, that the strike was over, and I had gotten a definite impression that this strike was over. Well, it is not over, and I encourage people to find out from the workers from Detroit, if possible, just exactly what's going on. I'd also like to ask people to take an interest in the case of a young American woman who was a student at MIT just a few years ago, who's 28 years old and who has been in prison for over a year now, sentenced to life in prison by a secret military tribunal in Peru, accused of a variety of different things depending on what time the government was making the accusations. Basically had no opportunity to defend herself, and again has been described in the New York Times as having admitted to being a member of the MRTA. This is not true. In fact, there was a recent statement from the official MRTA representative in Europe, for what that's worth, that she was in no way a member and did in no way know anything about this whole thing. And her name is Lori Berenson, and you can write her in prison. Do what you can to help. You can find out more about it if you have access to the World Wide Web. There is a page with a lot of very good information about her. My question to you would be, there are so many different issues, and I hope other people will make announcements and bring forward other concerns. But I guess, does either of you have any insight, any thought about how this very disparate and energetic, fragmented series of organizations and movements might come together to be a more unified force in this society?
Could we encourage you to use the mics on the podium, since most of the alternative media is hooked up there?
You can always tell who wins. No, you take the tough questions. I don't know. Well, sure, that's our big, that's a big problem. We have lots of things going on in the country. People in one part of the country don't know what's happening in another part of the country. There's an amazing number of actions that take place all over this country. If you travel around the country, Noam does, and he knows about these. If you travel around the country, it's amazing what is going on. I mean, you're in Duluth, Minnesota, and you're at a meeting of 300 people, and there are 16 tables in the back of the room with 16 different organizations in Duluth. I'm not trying to put down Duluth, but you don't expect it, you see, but it's everywhere. And so the problem, how is these going to be brought together? I said, yes, I don't know, except that I think it will take a kind of a concentration on some central issue. As and during the civil rights movement, we had the central issue of racial segregation that created a national movement, and during Vietnam, we had that as a unifying issue, which brought all sorts of organizations together. It just seems to me if there's any issue that can bring all the different groups together, it's the issue of the rational and just distribution of the enormous wealth of the United States, you see. And that, because it affects everybody. It affects the women's groups and the environmental groups and the anti-war groups. It affects everybody because everybody, the problems cannot be solved without using the resources that we have, and they're available.
I'm not addressing my question to any particular person who wants to take it. As we